In the year 1227, the earth trembled not from war, but from the silence that followed. The greatest conqueror the world had ever known, Genghis Khan, was dead, yet his death was cloaked in secrecy, much like the empire he built. His followers swore to keep the truth hidden. No public funeral, no grave to mourn, only whispers of a great shadow fading into the mountains of western Xia. But death is never the end of power. It is the beginning of chaos. Genghis Khan, born as Temujin, had spent the better part of his life uniting the fractured Mongol tribes and leading a whirlwind of conquest that spanned from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. Cities were reduced to ash. Dynasties fell. Rivers ran red. But when the old Khan finally succumbed, some say to injuries sustained in battle, others to illness or even assassination, he left behind more than a vast empire. He left behind a storm. The Mongol Empire, at the time of his death, was the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen. And yet, it was barely held together. Like the bones of a giant, the structure stood, but it needed muscles, a brain, and most of all, a heart to continue. That heart had always been Genghis himself. The immediate question that loomed was simple but perilous. Who would succeed the great Khan? Temujin had 4 surviving sons, Joki, Sorghaghtani, Ogidi, and Taiyue. But unity among them was a fragile illusion. Each had proven themselves on the battlefield, but their temperaments clashed like swords in a duel. Joki, the eldest, should have been a natural heir, but his legitimacy had always been under suspicion. Born shortly after his mother Borte was rescued from captivity by another tribe, whispers that he wasn't truly Genghis' son followed him his entire life. And worse, he had openly disagreed with his father on matters of strategy during the Western campaigns. By the time of Genghis' final days, Joki had already withdrawn from court politics and died, some say conveniently, before he could stake his claim. Then there was Sorghaghtani, bold, brash, and utterly loyal, but too inflexible, too harsh. He lacked the subtlety of a statesman. Though respected as a warrior, many feared his rule would collapse the empire in a storm of cruelty. The youngest son, Taiyue, had perhaps the deepest bond with Genghis. Brave, clever, and militarily gifted, he led key conquests, including the destruction of Khwarezmian Empire. Yet, despite his brilliance, he was never formally named successor. Instead, his role was protector of the homeland, the steely arm of the empire, not its head. That left one man, Ogidi, modest, diplomatic, and charming. Ogidi may not have been the strongest warrior, but he was undeniably the most balanced. Genghis, ever pragmatic, saw in him a ruler who could hold the empire together, not just conquer more land. Before his death, Genghis Khan summoned his inner circle, the Kurultai or Council of Tribal Chiefs, and named Ogidi as his heir. But even that decree could not erase the tensions bubbling beneath the surface. To ensure a smooth transition, Taiyue was appointed as regent until Ogidi could be officially enthroned. For a while, it worked. The empire stayed intact. But in truth, a silent power struggle had already begun. The death of the father did not heal divisions. It buried them like embers under sand, waiting to ignite. Even the burial of Genghis Khan became legend. According to myth, his funeral procession slaughtered everyone it passed, so no soul would know the location of tomb. His loyal soldiers supposedly diverted rivers to cover the grave. Some claim it lies in the Kenai Mountains. Others believe it's beneath a sacred forest in Mongolia, untouched for centuries. But the real secret was not the grave. It was what the empire would become without him. The Mongols had been forged in fire, blood brothers in battle. But now, they face a different war, the war of succession, of politics, and of identity. Could a people born to ride and conquer learn to rule? In the next chapter of this saga, we follow Ogidi Khan, the son who wore the crown. But peace would not last long. The same ambition that made the Mongols great would soon begin to tear them apart. Stay with us, because this is only the beginning of the hidden reign. Ogidi Khan was not a man who conquered with sword and scream. He was a son who conquered with patience and paperwork. While Genghis had scorched the earth with fire and fury, Ogidi brought something the Mongol Empire desperately needed: order. When Genghis Khan died, the foundation of his empire trembled, not from rebellion, but from uncertainty. Mongol tradition dictated that the next great Khan could only be chosen through a Kurultai, a council of nobles and tribal leaders. That meant Ogdiai's rule wasn't automatic, even with his father's blessing. But it was his brother Talyui, the youngest and arguably the most militarily powerful of the siblings, who made an unexpected move. He stepped aside and became regent, allowing Ogdiai's succession proceed without open conflict. This selfless act, some say motivated by loyalty, others by strategy, preserved the unity of the empire, at least for a time. In 1229, the Kurultai officially proclaimed Ogdiai as Khagan, the supreme ruler of the Mongols. But Ogdiai did not step into a throne. He stepped into a volcano. The empire stretched from the Sea of Japan to the edges of Europe, but its core remained tribal and mobile. Vast, diverse populations had been conquered, but not integrated. Trade routes needed protection. Bureaucracy was non-existent. Ogdiai knew that the Mongol Empire couldn't be sustained by force alone. It had to be governed. So he began to build. Ogdiai established Karakorum, the first true capital of the Mongol Empire. Nestled in the Orkhon Valley of Mongolia, it was more than a city. It was a symbol, a place where cultures collided. Muslim architects, Chinese artisans, Christian scribes, and Buddhist monks all worked side by side. Stone buildings rose where there had once been only yurts. Roads were carved. Bridges were laid. It was a pivot in Mongol identity, from nomadic raiders to imperial rulers. But the warrior spirit of the Mongols was far from dead. Under Ogdiai's command, the empire launched some of its most ambitious campaigns. One of the most significant, the invasion of Europe. Led by his nephew Batakhan and the infamous general Subutai, Mongol armies surged westward. In just a few years, they ravaged Eastern Europe, crushing Hungary, Poland, and much of the Russian principalities. The Battle of Legnica in 1241 saw Mongol forces wipe out a coalition of European knights. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Europe trembled. Some feared the apocalypse had arrived. Yet, just as the Mongols reached the gates of Vienna, they turned back. Why? Because Ogdiai had died. But let's not rush to the end just yet. Ogdiai's reign wasn't only defined by conquest. He implemented one of the most effective postal and relay systems in medieval history, the Yam system. Stations were placed every 25 to 30 miles across the empire. Riders could switch horses and carry urgent messages from the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea in a matter of days. It was a bloodstream of the empire, carrying news, orders, and even spies. He also conducted a comprehensive census of the empire. He wanted to know who lived where, what they owned, and what they could pay. While brutal by modern standards, this was revolutionary for the Mongols. It allowed for the introduction of tax systems, instead of relying solely on tribute through terror. But not all was well in Karakorum. Ogdiai was known to indulge. He was deeply fond of alcohol, reportedly drinking excessively every day. Despite his charisma and administrative reforms, his health deteriorated quickly. His advisors begged him to cut back. He agreed, and then ordered even more wine, supposedly saying, "A man's greatest joy is to live well, then die of drink." That is tragically what he did. In 1241, while in the middle of hunting and drinking with his court, Ogdiai collapsed and died. Some say from liver failure, others suspecting poisoning. With his death, the European campaign was aborted. The Mongol generals turned back, as was tradition, to attend the Kurultai for a new great Khan. Europe was spared not by bravery, but by bureaucracy. Ogdiai's legacy is paradoxical. He ruled for only 12 years, but in that time, he expanded the empire further than his father ever had, and gave it something even Genghis couldn't: structure. But structure brings with it a terrible cost: ambition. With Ogdiai's death, his sons believed they were next in line, but so did Talyui's sons. And so began the next phase of the empire, the hidden war within. In the next episode, we meet the silent architects of Mongol history, the women who ruled from behind the curtain, weaving alliances, commanding armies, and crowning emperors. Their names are rarely remembered, but their power was unforgettable. History tends to celebrate kings and conquerors. But behind the war cries of Genghis Khan and the decrees of Ogdi, there were voices less visible, yet just as commanding. These were the women of the Mongol Empire, not silent partners or ceremonial consorts, but rulers, regents, diplomats, and sometimes ruthless power brokers. In Mongol culture, women had more freedom and influence than in many other civilizations of the medieval world. They could ride, hunt, manage households, and even lead armies. But it wasn't just tradition that made them powerful, it was necessity. In a world where emperors rode off for months or years to conquer distant lands, someone had to hold the empire together. That someone, more often than not, was a woman. Let's begin with Borte, the first and primary wife of Genghis Khan. Her abduction in early adulthood launched Temujin into his first war of vengeance. But she was far more than a victim. She was a political and emotional anchor of the man who became the Great Khan. Borte was instrumental in forming alliances with rival tribes and solidifying Genghis's legitimacy. Their children together, especially Joki and Ogdi, were considered royal not just because of Temujin's name, but because of Borte's bloodline, which linked to noble families across the steppe. Yet it was after Genghis's death that Mongol women truly came into their own. Enter Sorghaghtani Beki, the widow of Ogdi Khan. When Ogdi died in 1241, a vacuum of power emerged once again, and it was Sorghaghtani who filled it. As the empire waited for the Kublai to choose a new great Khan, Sorghaghtani seized the reins of power and ruled as regent for 5 years, longer than some Khans themselves. During this time, she appointed her own loyal ministers, controlled the empire's finances, and orchestrated the elevation of her favorite son, Gayuk, to the throne. She played a dangerous game, bribing officials, exiling opponents, and manipulating tribal leaders to secure her son's position. Her rule wasn't just tolerated, it was respected. Her court was well organized. Diplomats from Europe and the Islamic world sought her favor. A delegation from the Pope even visited during her regency, astonished to find a woman wielding such power in the East. But perhaps the most remarkable Mongol queen was Sorghaghtani Beki, the wife of Talyui and mother to 4 future Khans, Monk Kublai, Hulagu, and Erik Bok. Unlike Sorghaghtani, Sorghaghtani preferred to work behind the scenes. She was a devout Nestorian Christian in a sea of Buddhists, Muslims, and shamanists, yet her faith never isolated her. Instead, it sharpened her sense of diplomacy. She educated her sons not just in warfare, but in governance, theology, and multiple languages. She ensured their alliances with both Mongol nobles and subject peoples, from Chinese bureaucrats to Persian scholars. She taught them that to rule the world, one must understand it. When the time came for a new great Khan, Sorghaghtani launched a subtle but decisive campaign to promote her eldest son, Monk. Through bribes, marriages, promises, and perhaps blackmail, she convinced the Kublai to bypass Sorghaghtani's lineage and choose her own. When Monk was crowned in 1251, it was Sorghaghtani's ultimate triumph. But not all Mongol women ruled through sons and regency. Some led on the battlefield. Kublai, a great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan, was a fierce warrior princess of Central Asia. She reportedly challenged any suitor to a wrestling match. If they lost, they had to give her 100 horses. By the time she reached adulthood, she had a herd of 10,000. Legend claims no man ever defeated her. Some chronicles even suggest her father wanted her to rule, but she was blocked by male rivals. Her story was so captivating that centuries later, it inspired the character of Turandot in Western opera, although distorted into fantasy. In truth, Kublai was no fairy tale. She was a general, an advisor, and a symbol of female strength on the steppe. These women, Borte, Sorghaghtani, Sorghaghtani, Kublai, were not exceptions. They were emblematic of a unique Mongol system where power was mobile, pragmatic, and often female. They built alliances, steered wars, raised emperors, and crushed rebellions. Without them, the Mongol Empire might have fractured within a generation of Genghis's death. Yet their stories remain hidden in the folds of dusty chronicles and half-erased records, waiting to be remembered. In the next segment, we turn to one of the most mysterious figures in Mongol history, Talyui, Genghis's youngest son, a hero in war and a victim of palace politics. His death would not end his story, but begin the legacy of a dynasty. In the grand epic of Mongol history, Genghis Khan's sons are like pillars holding up a mighty empire. Yet one of these pillars was deliberately buried. His name whispered only in caution, his death cloaked in mystery. His name was Talyui, the youngest and most loyal of Genghis Khan's sons. Talyui was a warrior's warrior. While his older brothers quarreled or governed, Talyui led. He commanded Mongol forces during some of the bloodiest and most critical campaigns of the early empire. His siege and his shaper in Persia became legend. When his son-in-law was killed in battle, Talyui retaliated with such ferocity that an estimated 100,000 people were slaughtered, men, women, and children alike. To the Mongols, he was the sharpest sword. But swords, as history often shows, are dangerous even to the hand that wields them. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, Talyui was entrusted with the guardianship of the Mongol heartland. He served as regent while Ogidi prepared to ascend as Great Khan. Many believed Talyui had a rightful claim to the throne. He was militarily superior, had the loyalty of the army, and governed the Mongol homeland. But he did not challenge the decision, at least not openly. Was he genuinely loyal to his father's will? Or did he calculate that waiting would bring him more than fighting? As Ogidi began his reign, Talyui remained in the shadows. He continued to serve, lead campaigns, and secure the empire's borders. But in 1232, a sudden shift occurred. The Mongols launched a renewed invasion of northern China, targeting the remnants of the Jin dynasty. Talyui, as always, was at the front. After a particularly brutal campaign, his forces captured Luoyang, but an outbreak of disease swept through the ranks. Mongol superstitions ran high. When unexpected illness or misfortune struck the royal family, the shamans often blamed it on spiritual imbalance, or worse, cosmic punishment. Ogidi himself fell ill soon after. The royal advisors, desperate for an answer, turned to an ancient and chilling solution: ritual sacrifice. It is said that Talyui offered his life to save his brother, that he willingly drank a poison concoction prepared by the royal priests to absorb the curse threatening Ogidi. He died within days. A noble sacrifice, or a carefully orchestrated removal or rival? The story is as symbolic as it is suspicious. Many historians doubt the narrative of willing self-sacrifice. They point to court politics, rising tensions between Ogidi's faction and Talyui's growing influence. The timing was convenient. With Talyui gone, Ogidi's grip on the empire tightened. The military was loyal, but now leaderless. The sons of Talyui, Möngke, Kublai, Hulagu, and Erekbok, were still young, not yet threats. For now, yet Talyui's death would prove to be less an ending and more a beginning. In life, he had been overlooked. In death, his lineage would dominate the empire for decades. His wife, Sorghaghtani Beki, mourned, but did not retreat. She began preparing her sons for greatness. While the other branches of Genghis Khan's family grew fat with titles and feuds, Talyui's house grew strong in discipline, diplomacy, and education. Möngke, his eldest, trained not just as a warrior, but as an administrator. Kublai immersed himself in Chinese philosophy and governance. Hulagu learned Persian customs and military strategy. Erekbok stayed in the Mongol heartland, mastering the ways of steppe power. Sorghaghtani molded them into princes not just of blood, but of destiny. Decades later, it would be Talyui's sons who wore the imperial crown, not the sons of Ogidi or Sorghaghtani. In a cruel twist of fate, Ogidi's heirs would die out or fall from grace. Sorghaghtani's line would fracture, but Talyui's descendants would rule China, Persia, and even the remnants of the Golden Horde. The poison cup may have ended Talyui's life, but it was also the toast that opened a new chapter for the empire. In Mongol chronicles, the line between myth and motive is razor thin. Was Talyui a martyr, a victim, or a player who lost a game? We may never know for certain. But one truth remains. The sons of Talyui would reshape the empire more than any generation before or after. His legacy, once nearly erased, would become the foundation of a new Mongol age. In the next segment, we travel west, to the misty steppes and icy rivers of Rus. There, the Mongol presence casts a long shadow, not with fire, but with control. Welcome to the land of the Golden Horde. The year was 1237. Winter fell thick over the forests of Rus, blanketing rivers in ice and silencing the wind. But in that silence, hoofbeats thundered. The Mongols had come, not with a roar, but with a whisper. And behind that whisper rode a storm called Khan. Bata was the son of Joki, Genghis Khan's eldest and most controversial son. Though doubts surrounded Joki's paternity, Genghis had still entrusted him with campaigns in the west. After Joki's death, his son Batu inherited those ambitions. And so began one of the most devastating campaigns in Eastern Europe, the Mongol invasion of the Rus. From 1237 to 1240, the Mongols swept across Russian principalities. Cities like Ryazan, Vladimir, and Suzdal were razed. Entire populations were wiped out. Churches burned, princes executed, and survivors enslaved. At Kiev, the cultural and religious heart of Rus, the Mongols shattered walls and silenced bells. The once proud city became a graveyard of stone and ash. But the Mongols didn't stay to rule in the traditional sense. They didn't build capitals in the cities they destroyed. Instead, they established their own domain on the open steppe along the Volga River. This was the birth of the Golden Horde, a name as elegant as it was terrifying. Its capital was Sarai, a city that would become one of the largest in medieval Europe. Built by Bata Khan, Sarai was a marvel of multi-ethnic civilization, filled with Persians, Turks, Russians, Armenians, and Mongols alike. It became a hub of trade and tribute, a silent engine that fed the Mongol Empire. What made the Golden Horde unique was its style of rule. They did not colonize Rus. They didn't convert its people or replace its customs. Instead, they ruled through fear and finance. They demanded tribute, not just gold, but allegiance. Russian princes were forced to travel to Sarai and bow before Bata Khan, kissing the stirrup of his horse in submission. They returned with yarliks, official decrees of Mongol approval, giving them the right to rule their own people. Without that document, they were nothing. It was domination without direct governance, an empire in the shadows. This system of vassalage allowed the Mongols to extract wealth from the Rus lands while maintaining stability. And over time, the once independent Russian principalities became deeply entangled with Mongol politics. Mongol taxes funded their wars. Mongol armies intervened in their disputes. Mongol culture seeped into their courts. Yet, this wasn't pure tyranny. Bata Khan and his successors allowed religious freedom. Orthodox Christianity survived. Churches were rebuilt. Monks continued to write and preach. In some ways, the Mongol rule was more tolerant than the later czars who would come centuries later. But make no mistake, defiance was met with obliteration. In 1252, when Alexander Nevsky, a prince of Novgorod, sought Mongol approval over his brother, he secured his throne with Mongol troops. When others rebelled, their cities were burned anew. The Golden Horde made kings and unmade them just as easily. This iron grip lasted for generations. And yet, something strange happened over time. The Mongols of the Golden Horde began to change. They converted to Islam, adopted Turkic language and customs, and slowly distanced themselves from the Mongol heartlands. By the mid-14th century, they were Mongols in name, but Turks in culture, rulers of the steppe, but not riders of conquest. Their influence on Russia, however, was permanent. They altered the political landscape, centralizing power in Moscow. They introduced new forms of taxation, military hierarchy, and bureaucratic control. Some historians even argue that the autocratic tendencies of the later Russian czars can be traced directly to Mongol influence. But eventually, shadows fade. As the Mongol Empire fractured, so too did the Golden Horde. Internal rivalries, civil wars, and the plague weakened them. The rise of Moscow and the defiant Ivan III, who stopped paying tribute, marked the beginning of the end. By the 15th century, the once mighty Golden Horde splintered into smaller khanates, and their reign over Russia passed into legend. Yet for over 200 years, the Mongols shaped the destiny of a land they never truly ruled. A kingdom in the shadows, a power behind thrones. That was the Golden Horde. And in the next segment, we return to the east, to Möngke Khan, a ruler unlike any other, a man of numbers and vision, who sought not just to conquer, but to understand the empire he inherited. When Möngke Khan rose to power in 1251, the world expected another warlord, another hammer in a long line of Mongol conquest. But Möngke was different. Where others saw battlefields, he saw balance. Where others sought thrones, he sought knowledge. He was a warrior, yes, but also a philosopher, an economist, and perhaps the most intellectually curious ruler the Mongol Empire had ever seen. Möngke was a grandson of Genghis Khan and the eldest son of Talyui and Sorghaghtani Beki. From childhood, he had been groomed not just for war, but for wisdom. His mother, a master strategist in her own right, ensured he was educated in multiple languages and exposed ideas from across the empire. He could quote Confucius, debate with Islamic scholars, and understand complexities of Buddhist philosophy, all without ever betraying his Mongol roots. His rise to power was not without conflict. After the death of Genghis Khan, the Oghidid branch still believed the throne belonged to them. But Sorghaghtani Beki, ever the political chess master, rallied support for her son Möngke. At a carefully managed Kurultai in 1251, some say manipulated behind the scenes, Möngke was declared the new great Khan. Once in power, he made one thing clear. This would not be a reign of luxury or indulgence. It would be a reign of order. The first thing Möngke did was purge the imperial court. Many of Gaiuk's loyalists were executed or exiled. Corrupt tax collectors and advisors were removed. Möngke wanted clean governance, and he was willing to draw blood to get it. But it wasn't just a political purge. It was a reformation. He launched a sweeping census of the entire empire, from the forests of Russia to the rice paddies of China. This was no small feat. Teams of Mongol and foreign scribes were sent out in caravans to count people, livestock, and resources. For the first time, the Mongol Empire had hard data about populations, land value, taxation, and manpower. It was one of the largest and most ambitious censuses in world history. Möngke believed that to rule effectively, you had to know your empire, and so he used this data to reform tax systems. Gone were the days of arbitrary levies and endless tribute. Instead, a more structured and, dare we say, fair tax code was implemented. Peasants, merchants, and nobles knew what they owed and when. It stabilized the economy, increased revenue, and reduced rebellions. Yet Möngke was not content to just sit in Karakorum and count coins. He was still a Mongol. He believed expansion was destiny. He launched simultaneous campaigns on two massive fronts. In the west, he ordered his brother Hulagu to march into the heart of the Islamic world, toward Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate. The goal: subjugate the last remnants of Islamic political power and expand the empire into Persia and the Middle East. In the east, Möngke led an invasion of southern China, determined to crush the Song dynasty once and for all. He believed that only by conquering China entirely could the Mongol rule be secure and legitimate. But war is not predictable. In 1259, during a campaign in the Chinese province of Sichuan, Möngke fell ill. Some say from dysentery, others claim it was cholera or even poisoning. Within weeks, he was dead. The Mongol army, stunned, halted its advance. The chain of command fractured. Across the empire, news spread like wildfire. Möngke Khan, the philosopher-warrior, was gone. His death marked a turning point in Mongol history. Unlike Genghis or Oghidid, Möngke left no clear successor. His brothers, Kublai and Bek, would soon be locked in a brutal civil war for the throne. The empire that Möngke had spent years stabilizing would be pulled apart by ambition and pride. But Möngke's legacy remained. He was the last great Khan to rule over a united Mongol Empire. After him, the four Khanates, Yuan in China, Ilkhanate in Persia, Chagatai in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia, began to operate independently. His efforts at reform and unity would echo for decades, but never again would one man control it all. Möngke's reign was short, only 8 years, but his impact was profound. He proved that a Mongol could be both conqueror and statesman. That power could be tempered by thought. That empire, when guided by knowledge, could achieve more than mere destruction. In the next segment, we follow Möngke's most famous brother, Kublai Khan, the emperor who turned from steppe to silk and traded war drums for court music, a Mongol who became more Chinese than the Chinese themselves. He was born on the steppes, raised in the saddle, and trained for war. But when Kublai Khan gazed across the empire, he saw something his ancestors had ignored. A civilization that could be conquered not just with swords, but with culture. Kublai Khan, the second son of Taiyue and Sorghaghtani Beki, was a man of contradictions. He loved Mongol traditions, the hunt, the yurts, the open skies, but he was also captivated by Chinese philosophy, administration, and refinement. Where others saw the Chinese as subjects to crush, Kublai saw an opportunity. What if, instead of destroying the Song dynasty, he could become its rightful heir? It was a radical idea, and it would change the Mongol Empire forever. After Möngke Khan's death in 1259, Kublai rushed back to the Mongol heartland to attend the Kurultai and claim the title of Great Khan. But he wasn't alone. His younger brother, Erik Bok, declared himself Khan as well, backed by conservative Mongol nobles who feared Kublai's growing love for foreign customs. What followed was the first true civil war of the Mongol Empire. For 4 years, Kublai and Erik Bok battled for the soul of the empire, one brother backed by the traditions of the steppe, the other by Chinese bureaucrats, Persian merchants, and Buddhist monks. In 1264, Kublai finally emerged victorious. Erik Bok surrendered and died in captivity, but the cost was immense. The unity of the Mongol Empire was shattered. From that point on, Kublai ruled primarily over the eastern half of the empire, China, Mongolia, and Korea. And in 1271, he made a bold declaration. He would no longer rule as simply Great Khan. He would become Emperor of China and establish the Yuan dynasty. It was a symbolic shift. For the first time, a foreign conqueror had taken the mandate of heaven, claiming the right to rule all of China, not as an outsider, but as its legitimate emperor. Kublai adopted Chinese court rituals, built a new capital at Dadu, modern-day Beijing, and filled his court with Confucian scholars, Buddhist lamas, Islamic mathematicians, and even Nestorian Christian advisors. His court was one of the most cosmopolitan in the world, but his embrace of China came at a price. Many Mongol nobles saw Kublai's transformation as betrayal. He wore silk robes instead of fur. He lived in palaces instead of tents. He spoke Chinese, passed Confucian laws, and worshipped in Buddhist temples. To them, he was no longer truly Mongol. And back on the steppes, other Khanates, the Chagatai in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Ilkhanate in Persia, began acting independently, refusing to recognize Kublai's authority. The Great Mongol Empire had become an empire in name only. Still, Kublai pressed forward. In 1279, after decades of war, he finally conquered the southern Song dynasty, unifying China for the first time in centuries. It was one of the greatest achievements of his reign. His Yuan dynasty controlled more land and people than any dynasty before it. Trade flourished. The Silk Road was secured. Cities grew. Chinese scholars and Mongol generals worked side by side. And yet, something fell hollow. Kublai struggled to manage the expectations of both the Mongols and the Chinese. His Chinese subjects viewed him as a foreign occupier. His Mongol relatives whispered that he had gone soft. Rebellions broke out. Famine and floods devastated the countryside. Kublai grew old, fat, and increasingly isolated, mourning the deaths of his wife and son, retreating into his palace. Even the famed Marco Polo, who spent over 17 years at Kublai's court, remarked on the emperor's declining health and heavy melancholy in his final years. Kublai Khan died in 1294. He was buried in secret. Following the old Mongol tradition, his tomb hidden somewhere in the mountains of Mongolia. His successors would rule China for several more decades, but the cracks had already formed. By embracing China, Kublai had built a new dynasty, but he had also lost the empire. The dream of a unified Mongol world, governed from Karakorum, was gone. In its place stood regional powers with their own identities, goals, and loyalties. Yet Kublai's legacy endures. He showed that Mongol rule didn't have to mean destruction. It could mean administration, infrastructure, tolerance, and cultural fusion. His empire was not built solely on blood, but on bridges. In the next chapter, we explore the height of that cultural and commercial exchange, a period historians call Pax Mongolica, a time when roads were safer than ever, merchants moved freely, and knowledge flowed across continents. It was peace, but Mongol peace. In an age when the world was torn by warring kingdoms and tribal feuds, one empire accomplished the unimaginable. It connected Europe to Asia, China to Persia, Moscow to Baghdad, all under a single banner. This was not just a military achievement. It was a logistical miracle. The world remembers the Mongols as destroyers, but between the ashes of war rose a period of astonishing prosperity, trade, and safety. Historians call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. From the mid-13th to the late 14th century, the vast Mongol Empire made something revolutionary possible: globalization before modernity. Imagine the Silk Road, an ancient artery of commerce and culture, now supercharged under Mongol rule. Roads were maintained, bridges repaired, oases protected. Mongol patrols guarded caravans, and anyone caught robbing a traveler was punished harshly, regardless of rank. For the first time in centuries, merchants, monks, and messengers could cross thousands of miles in relative safety. Trade exploded. Silk from China flowed west. Spices, jade, tea, and porcelain filled the markets of Samarkand, Tabriz, and Constantinople. In return, the East received silver from Europe, glassware, wool, and gems from India and the Middle East. Ideas traveled too: papermaking, printing, medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. Even more astonishing was the postal system, the yam. Every 25 to 30 miles across the empire, from Korea to Kiev, relay stations stood ready with fresh horses, food, and lodging. Official couriers carried messages in record time. Genghis Khan himself had designed the blueprint, but under rulers like Ogidi and Kublai, the system became one of the most sophisticated communication networks in history. It was, in effect, a medieval internet. At the heart of this flow of knowledge and commerce was something even more powerful: tolerance. The Mongols did not impose a single religion. They welcomed all: Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Jews, Zoroastrians. They allowed missionaries to travel freely. Cathedrals were built in China. Buddhist temples thrived in Central Asia. Sufi mystics preached in Mongol-occupied Persia. This religious openness wasn't altruism. It was strategy. A diverse empire was easier to rule when you didn't force conformity. But Mongol tolerance had its limits. The empire may have been peaceful on the surface, but it was built on surveillance and fear. Mongol rulers employed intelligence agents, called Möngke, who acted as spies, tax inspectors, and regional informants. They monitored governors, checked caravan records, and reported directly to the Khan. Travelers were registered at checkpoints, and merchants required permits. It was order through observation. You were free to move, but not invisible. And speaking of travelers, perhaps no figure captured this era better than Marco Polo. The young Venetian journeyed across the empire in the 1270s and spent over 17 years in Mongol China, serving at the court of Kublai Khan. His descriptions of dazzling cities, grand ceremonies, and highways buzzing with traders painted a picture of an empire that was not just powerful, but civilized in ways Europe had never imagined. His book, The Travels of Marco Polo, opened European eyes to a world of unimaginable wealth, technology, and stability. It would later inspire explorers like Christopher Columbus. But the world Marco Polo described was only possible under the umbrella of Pax Mongolica. Ironically, it was this openness, the flow of people and goods, that would also become the empire's downfall. From the east, hidden in the gut of a flea, the Black Death traveled westward along the same roads that carried silk and silver. It reached Crimea in the 1340s, then jumped to Italy, France, and beyond. Within a few decades, over 75 million people would die. The plague shattered cities, economies, and belief systems. And with it, the stability of the Mongol world began to fracture. Pax Mongolica, like all peace, was temporary. But while it lasted, it was one of the most extraordinary experiments in human history. A globalized world in the pre-modern age, powered by horses and governed by khans. In the next chapter, we witness a decline firsthand. The civil wars, rival khanates, and the final unraveling of a once mighty empire. For even the strongest empire cannot escape the pull of time and ambition. At its height, the Mongol Empire stretched across 2 continents, encompassing more territory than any other land empire in history. But even the most unstoppable force eventually faces resistance from within. The cracks began to show soon after the death of Kublai Khan in 1294. Though he was succeeded by his grandson Timur, the chain of unity had already snapped. The vast empire, once ruled from a single throne, had split into 4 major khanates, each drifting further apart. There was the Yuan dynasty in China, Kublai's legacy; the Ilkhanate in Persia, founded by Hulagu; the Sorghaghtani Khanate in Central Asia, descended from Genghis's second son; and the Golden Horde in the northwest, controlling the steppes of Russia. At first, these khanates recognized the symbolic authority of the great Khan in China, but that recognition faded fast. By the early 14th century, the Mongol Empire was Mongol in name only, a collection of competing kingdoms, bound not by loyalty but by bloodlines and memory. The Yuan dynasty struggled the most. Though China had been conquered, it had not been tamed. Resentment festered among the Han Chinese majority. Mongol rulers remained culturally aloof, living apart, governing with foreign ministers, and maintaining Mongol supremacy in all affairs. Over time, droughts, famine, floods, and corruption crippled the state. By 1351, a massive peasant uprising known as the Red Turban Rebellion erupted. Mongol authority collapsed in region after region. The rebellion wasn't just about hunger, it was about identity. The Chinese were ready to cast off foreign rule. And in 1368, a former monk-turned-rebel general named Zhu Yuanzhang stormed the Yuan capital of Dadu. The Mongols fled north. The Ming dynasty was born. The Yuan dynasty, once the pride of the empire, had become the first to fall. In Persia, the Ilkhanate also spiraled into chaos. Hulagu's descendants ruled effectively for a time, blending Mongol governance with Persian culture. But after the death of Abu Sa'idi in 1335, no clear heir remained. The Khanate fractured into competing dynasties, warlords, and tribal factions. The central authority collapsed, and the Mongols of Persia were absorbed into the Persian identity they had once ruled over. The Sorghaghtani Khanate in Central Asia became a hotbed of division. Its eastern and western halves often acted like separate states, fighting for supremacy. Eventually, out of this chaos rose a figure who would eclipse the Mongols in the region entirely: Tamerlane, or Timur the Lame. Though not a direct descendant of Genghis, Timur claimed his legacy, using Mongol ideology to justify his conquests. But make no mistake, he was no heir, and the Sorghaghtani were never the same. And in the north, the Golden Horde, once feared across Europe, began to fade. Plague ravaged its population. Civil wars tore it apart. Rival Khans competed for legitimacy. And in the shadow of this decline, the Russian principalities, especially Moscow, grew stronger. In 1380, at the Battle of Kulikovo, the Russians under Prince Dmitry Donskoy struck a symbolic blow against Mongol domination. Though the horde would return briefly, the tide had turned. By the early 15th century, the Golden Horde splintered into smaller Tatar Khanates: Kazan, Crimea, Astrakhan, each a shadow of Mongol might. But it wasn't just politics that doomed the Mongols. It was assimilation. They had ruled over such vast and diverse lands that they eventually became part of them. In Persia, they became Persians. In China, Chinese. In Russia, Turkic. The Mongol identity, the nomadic, horse-riding, sky-worshipping essence of steppe, faded into the cultures they once dominated. It was a slow erosion, not a dramatic fall, but dissolving of unity, like ink in water. And yet, their impact never disappeared. They had redrawn the map of the old world. They had changed the course of Chinese, Russian, Persian, and even European history. They had connected the world through trade, ideas, and war. The Mongols might have lost their empire, but they had altered civilization itself. In the final segment, we journey into the legacies, the myths, the ruins, the genetic markers, and the ghostly imprints the Mongols left behind. The empire is gone, but the shadow of the Khan still stretches across continents. The campfires are cold now. The horses are gone. The thunder of hooves no longer shakes the earth. But the Mongol Empire, though vanished from maps, lives on in names and borders and bloodlines in the architecture of our modern world. What does it mean for an empire to end, yet never disappear? Let's begin with the physical. across Asia and Eastern Europe, traces of the Mongols linger. In Beijing, the layout of the old Yuan capital, Dadu, can still be seen beneath the modern city. In Samarkand and Baghdad, ruined Mongol palaces and administrative compounds sit like bones beneath desert sands. In Russia, cities like Kazan and Astrakhan bear the names of Tatar Khanates born from the Golden Horde's ashes. Even more enduring is the Silk Road, once guarded and revitalized under Mongol rule. Though it faded with time, its legacy laid the groundwork for global trade networks that persist today. The very idea of globalization, of interconnected markets, multicultural exchange, and multinational policy can trace its roots back to Pax Mongolica. But the Mongols left behind more than infrastructure. They left behind systems. They revolutionized governance, uniting diverse populations under a flexible and pragmatic administrative model. They absorbed useful practices from every region they conquered: Chinese tax records, Persian bureaucrats, Russian tribute structures. In many ways, the Mongols were early federalists, allowing local autonomy under a central Khan's authority. Their emphasis on meritocracy, though imperfect, often put skill above blood. A Persian vizier, a Nestorian Christian accountant, or a Chinese engineer could rise in Mongol service if they proved useful. It was a kind of brutal, efficient cosmopolitanism. Even today, echoes of Mongol rule ripple through modern governance. The idea of passports, standardized weights and measures, and international postal systems can all be linked to the innovations pioneered under Mongol rule. And then there's a genetic legacy. It's often claimed, perhaps exaggerated, that Genghis Khan has over 16 million male descendants alive today, bearing markers of his Y chromosome across Central Asia. While the exact number may be debated, the genetic footprint is undeniable. The Mongols did not merely conquer. They intermixed, married, and fathered children in every land they touched. But perhaps the most haunting legacy is the myth. Genghis Khan, once demonized in the West as a barbarian and a butcher, has been re-evaluated in recent decades. To Mongolians, he is a national hero, his face on currency, his name on airports. In China, Kublai Khan is remembered as a legitimate emperor of the Yuan dynasty. In Russia and Central Asia, the Mongols are both feared ancestors and ancestral rulers. The Mongol Empire reshaped the very idea of power. They showed the world that control need not always come from towering walls or ancient dynasties, but from speed, communication, adaptability, and sheer will. And then, just as quickly as they rose, they faded. No last stand. No climactic fall. Just fragmentation. Blending in. Becoming one with the people they ruled. Today, as you drive through the Gobi Desert or fly over the steppes of Kazakhstan, you might see a cluster of yurts, a man riding a horse with a bow slung over his shoulder. He may not call himself Mongol Empire, but in his blood, in his movement, in the arc of his ancestors, he is. The empire is gone, but its spirit remains. In trade, in governance, in the idea that the world, vast and varied, can be connected, and that sometimes the most powerful legacies aren't written in stone, but in the wind that crosses a steppe. Don't just watch history, uncover it. Subscribe to the Crit Stories and ride with us through the empires that shaped our world. Hit the bell and explore the stories they never taught in school.